Well, welcome to Lesson 3 of our Introduction to the Old Testament. We noted last time that we met that we looked at the Bible as being like three different kinds of things. We looked at the Bible as being like a map, that it guides us in our Christian walk. We looked at the Bible as being like a collection of testimonies, voices from the past, people who have engaged and experienced God, giving us their own interpretation and their own experiences that inform our faith and understanding. And of course the Bible as a measuring stick, so like a ruler or like a measuring line, a standard by which we can measure our life and our faith and our theology. And so the Bible is important for us as we begin to explore what it means. What we'll be looking at over the next few weeks is how we actually read the Old Testament. So we looked in the first lesson at our three significant questions that we have. What we'll be looking at today is like an overview of those three parts of the question, and then we'll begin to unpack specifically what that entails. So what does it mean to an ancient Israelite? What was their world? We'll ask that kind of question next lesson as we explore in more detail the significance to them. But today we're going to look at our three main questions. What we've noticed already as we begin to reflect on the testimonies of the Old Testament is that we identify with these different characters. So as we hear the testimony of Joshua, as we hear the testimony of Jeremiah and Isaiah and hear about David, we identify with these different characters. As we read Genesis 12 and heard the call of Abraham, we resonated with his struggle to leave behind all the old loyalties and the former hold on his life and accept in faith and obedience the call of God. And we understand and resonate with these different experiences and testimonies of the people in the Old Testament. And we identify them not just because we identify with their triumphs or with their failures even, but we understand and we resonate with them because their story is part of our story. That we, in a sense, are part of the bigger picture. We're part of the overall testimony of what God has been doing in history that included the ancient Israelites, that included Jesus Christ and the early church, and continues on God's work within history that continues up to this point where we are today. So we see ourselves as part of this story, ongoing history and story of God's interaction in the world. What we're looking at today is building on that foundation. We're looking at how we read the Old Testament. And in particular, we'll be exploring these three questions that we introduced in the first week. This idea of what is the significance to them, what is the significance to us, and what is the significance to me? Because what we notice is when we understand the Bible as being like a collection of testimonies, is that when we hear the story of Abraham, when we hear the story of David and Joshua and Ruth and all these wonderful characters and narratives and stories that we have in our Old Testament, when we hear about these events, we resonate with these different characters. We identify with them not just because we've experienced similar encounters and life experience, or because we've had a similar failure or triumph. We resonate with them because their story is also part of our story as well. That they are our heritage. They are the heritage of the people of faith. And so their story has significance for us because we continue that same story. We continue the testimony of God at work within the world. We continue the testimony of God drawing and interacting with humanity that the testimony of the Old Testament presents us for ancient Israel. And we continue that story. We see that God's interaction with people through the New Testament, through the coming of Jesus Christ and his life ministry and work on the cross, the testimony of the early church. We are a continuation of their story. And so it didn't just end when the Old Testament closed, or it didn't just end when the New Testament closed, but we are part of that same story. And so we identify with these characters in the Old Testament. We identify with the events in the Old Testament because we're participants in this very same story that is going on. And so as we read the Old Testament, we're reading it as part of our heritage. We're reading it as part of our heritage of faith. And as these people in the Old Testament knew God, as they encountered God and held up the flame, so to speak, of God's love and rule for all to see, we continue that task. So the task and the mission of the Old Testament we see continues and has importance for us as New Testament believers. So for example, in 1 Peter chapter 2, when Peter wants to try and explain to the Christians in that letter of what their vocation, what their mission and their calling as Christians and as believers in Jesus Christ is, he draws on the mission and the vocation of ancient Israel. He talks about how in the New Testament, in 1 Peter chapter 2, you're called to be a kingdom of priests. You were called out of the darkness into the glorious light of Christ, so that you could be a holy nation, a people of God. And these very terms are actually terms that come from the Old Testament. Yeah. So for the church, for us to understand what our mission, what our vocation is, we also need to understand the mission and vocation of ancient Israel. That we see resonance, we see a reflection of that within the early church and for us today. And as we look at what the mission of Israel was, ancient Israel, as we look at their calling and how they attempted to live that out in their daily lives, we see this testimony of God's interaction with them. And so as we look at that, we're not reading something that is just as an object to be studied for information. We're reading that as part of our story. And in a sense, it's a little bit like gazing at a loved one, I guess even you can say. That when, for example, my niece and nephews were born, that we raced to the hospital and we wanted to see these little treasures that were a gift of God for our family, and we examined them. We looked at them, I think our examination was more detailed than even the medical practitioners. We made sure there were 5 fingers on each hand and 5 toes on each foot, and we examined these little children. But it wasn't because we could go, look how red and wrinkly their newborn skin is. It wasn't so we could criticise or pull it apart and see it as a disinterested observer. This was something that was a subject, something that was loved to us. And in the same way, and in a sense, that's how we can be viewing the Old Testament as well. Doesn't mean that we leave our brains behind. So when the babies were born, we began to look for little personality quirks that we thought, or where they might be similar to their mother or father. And we analysed these children and began to predict what they'd be like. So we didn't leave our brains behind, but we examined them with an eye, in the sense that they were part of our family. And in the same way, when we're reading the Old Testament, we're reading it as part of the story of our family. That it's not just a textbook of human history, but a testimony of God's relationship and interaction with his people. It's a history that continues up to the present community of our church. And it will continue on in the future. And so this terminology that we've used a couple of times of the people of God was first used in the Old Testament. And it's quite an important phrase in the Old Testament as well. It's probably the most basic term to refer to God's special relationship with ancient Israel. And as their testimony, as their interaction with God developed, we see that this group of people, ancient Israel, that were the children of Abraham, that promise given to them, Abraham in Genesis 12 that we looked at in the first week, they became to be called the people of God. They were the inheritors of this promise of a special relationship. And so when Moses confronted Pharaoh, as these children of Abraham continued on, as they journeyed and then were led down to go into Egypt and then became enslaved under the later pharaohs, we see that with Moses, the deliverer came to the people of Israel. When he confronted the Pharaoh in the Exodus, he spoke as the mouthpiece of God, and he said to Pharaoh, "Let my people go." Because at the core of Israel's relationship to God was the promise and the confidence that they had that they were the people of God. And that was a special relationship. And it set them apart from the other nations. And it became, in a sense, a definitive way of them understanding who they were, their vocation, and their mission. But that terminology that they were to be the people of God didn't mean that they were better than the other nations or that they were more special. What it meant was that God had chosen them in His grace. They were no better than any other nation. God had chosen them in His grace to be the vehicle through which God would reveal Himself. And in the same way, we can see in our own lives, why are we called? There's nothing in any one of us that makes us more special than someone else. It's God's grace. And we see that for ancient Israel in their understanding of this idea of them being the people of God. And so, while in ancient Israel, the entrance into this special and unique group of the people of God was based on their racial identity, so it was ethnically driven, we see that when we come to the New Testament, there begins to be a shift. So in the Old Testament, faith is important, but we see that one of the main ways that people knew they were part of the people of God was that they became an ethnic Israelite. So in the book of Ruth, for example, that we've referred to, we see that Ruth moves and travels to the geographic location of ancient Israel, and she lives there as an Israelite, and she accepts their faith. And so we see that this is a shift in that. As the old proverb says, walk a mile in my shoes and you sort of see what life is like in my moccasins. So we see that this proverb encourages us to sort of, in a sense, put on the shoes, put on the mind, so to speak, of what the lives and the perspectives and the experiences of those different people are. And so there's 3 different shoes that I want you to imagine that you're trying on. So for example, we have the sandal of the Old Testament. So this is sort of as mangy leather sandal I could find. So this is like the pair of ancient sandals that an Israelite might have worn. And it's sort of the leather sandals of the ancient Israelite community. The second pair is the walking shoes of the New Testament, because they were a group and a community all about the mission of Jesus Christ, sharing the stories and retelling the events of the life of Jesus, and then beginning to send that message around the world. And so these are the walking shoes of the New Testament church that we continue. But of course, it's not just what God did in the past. When we read the Old Testament, it's not just what God spoke to former communities, it's what God is also speaking to us in a fresh revelation today. And so we need our own shoes. And probably out of all the shoes, this is obviously the most comfortable for us. So this is my shoe, but you might have your own that you want to wear. And so when I'm wearing my shoe, in a sense, this represents what God is saying to me in my situation, in my life at the moment. And so by walking a mile in these different shoes, by sharing in the testimonies of what others have done, reminds us that, to begin with, the world doesn't revolve around me, that God's been at work for a long time and I'm one participant in this grand history of what God has been doing. But it also helps me to appreciate the life and the journey and the experience of others who have gone before me, that enhances my own reflection on what God has been doing in the world that I'm living in. And again, by appreciating these 3 different testimonies, it reminds us that God speaks to people where they're at. God spoke to the ancient Israelites in their shoes, in their ancient leather walking shoes, in their sandals. God spoke to the New Testament community as they began to journey. God spoke in their language. And this emphasizes the immanence of God, a term to refer to the closeness of God. That God is close by. God reaches out to us. That Scripture didn't just fall from heaven, but is the product of the historical and cultural context, and a product of the community that received it and recorded it and preserved it. So it's not transcultural. We understand it within the culture that it was given. But it doesn't mean it's not meaningful for us. It means that there's a wealth and a treasure there for us, that we need to read it in our own shoes as well. So So first of all, what is the significance for them? And again, we'll explore these in more detail, particularly in the next lesson when we look at the cultural world and the background of ancient Israel. But when we read the Old Testament and we seek to understand God's voice and hear what God is saying, we don't read it in isolation from the testimony of the people that it presents. God has not changed. And so the actions and the character and the intentions of God for all of humanity are the same today as what they have been for all of the biblical communities. And so for this reason, we need to ask, what is the significance for them? Because the people of God in the Old Testament times had a witness and a testimony of God's actions amongst them. They had a long history of dynamic interaction with God, and within a society that was continually changing. Even though we talk about Old Testament times, even within that time period, their culture and their society was drastically changing. They went, for example, when God called Abraham, when God called him, he called him as a nomad, so someone who wasn't fixed in one city, so to speak, but travelled around in tents and lived a nomadic lifestyle. But then we see later on when the people have left Egypt and they settle in the Promised Land, in the book of Joshua and Judges, we see that they become a pastoral society. So they're no longer kind of wandering from place to place, but now they're fixed to the land. And that means a whole different shift in the way that they do things. So, they build wells, they have established houses. That changes their whole social structure, their infrastructure that's needed for their community changes. And we see that as it develops under the kings, we see that it becomes more like an urban society. And so again, that changes. So even when we talk about Old Testament times, it's important that we remember that it was actually a dynamic and changing community even within that. But this leads us to a dilemma. Because it's a community that was dynamic and changing, and a community that is very different to us as well. So when I put on these shoes of ancient Israel, they're not my shoes. Well, actually this one is, but you know what I mean. They're not our shoes. We're not living in the same culture. We're not living in the same world. We don't think the same way. Because their testimony is located in a specific cultural, historical period. And the way that they viewed their world was very, very different to ours. So, for example, I recently just bought a unit. The very fact of buying a unit would be quite foreign to ancient Israelites, but I just bought a unit. And the whole process, as I reflect upon it, I talked to a mortgage broker, and talked to the real estate agent, we began to negotiate. We emailed each other about the prices of calling each other. Then we exchanged contracts, went to lawyers, and then finally settled, and I moved in. As I reflect on that process, and I think, well, what would an ancient Israelite do? And we see that even basic functions within that society were completely different. So, for example, in the book of Ruth, again, we see that when Boaz begins to negotiate about the land that was held by Ruth's husband, who had died, and she was the widow, we see that Ruth cannot go on her own. She needs to have a male representative. So the very fact of a woman buying a unit probably wouldn't even happen in ancient Israel. And so Ruth had to find a representative, and eventually Boaz puts up his hand and says that he'll go and represent Ruth. And so he goes, he talks to the elders, goes to the city gate, talks to the elders, they negotiate, someone else is meant to do it, and then he gives the responsibility or privilege to Boaz. And then once the negotiations have closed, we see that Boaz takes off his sandal and exchanges that with the other man. And that's how the negotiation and, in a sense, the purchasing of the property is made. That's a whole other world away. I didn't go to the bank and then take my shoe off and swap it with the bank manager when I wanted to buy my house. Completely different process and way of operating in the world and the way of doing things. And so when we're reading the Old Testament, we're reading a completely different world and culture. But yet, on the other hand, while their culture is so different yet they're still people. And people are people wherever you go in the world and whatever time. And so we see that there's still a whole lot of humanity that we see within their testimony as well, even though their culture is so different from us. And this idea of identifying a difference in culture is really important when we're reading the Old Testament. And it's what we call the horizon of the text. It's a little bit like I'm standing on this mountaintop and I'm looking across the valley at another mountaintop, which is the culture and the time and the history of ancient Israel. And what I'm doing is I'm recognizing that I am not ancient Israel. I don't think the same. I don't act the same. My world is very different. And there's a gap between the ancient Israelites and their world and me and my world. And so I recognize by this identification of the horizon of the text, I'm recognizing that their world, their culture is very different to mine. And when I'm reading, I'm wanting to try and connect my horizon with their horizon. So it doesn't mean that I become an ancient Israelite, that suddenly I, throw away all my clothing so I can just have pure linen and go to the bank manager and try and force my shoe on him. Doesn't mean that I become an ancient Israelite, but I'm trying to make a connection between their world and then my world as well. And so these social differences are important, but we recognize them that they are different on a different horizon to us, but yet again they're people just like us. And so this task of interpretation wants us to bridge the gap a bit. And so we step into their world, we try and understand their world so that we can see what God was doing, how they were responding to God, and some of the principles that work through their story. We try to understand their world, which is a good communication principle in its own right. And so that's what we're doing when we're seeking to understand the significance to them. The second question, what is the significance to us, is also very important. Through the testimony of them, of ancient Israel, we observe God at work. And we know and understand something about God because of what God had been doing amongst the ancient Israelites. And we know God, for example, to be caring because Psalm 23 tells us about the good shepherd who loves us and cares for us. And that is the very same image that Jesus Christ drew upon to identify himself as God. As Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. And so for us as Christian readers of the Bible, who are part of the people of God, we continue that same story. The Christian community are part of the ongoing story of God. We're participants in what God has been doing within the world to restore this creation back to himself. And we see that this continuation is expressed through the newer covenant of the New Testament. And this newer covenant that is founded and orientated around the person of Jesus Christ. And so when we ask what is the significance to us, we're asking how do we see Jesus Christ fulfilled in this passage? Because the New Testament emphasizes that salvation is only found in faith in Jesus Christ. So Jesus Christ is the center of God's actions. As we read as New Testament believers, we look back through the cross to see the Old Testament, and we observe God's actions, and we observe that God has been working to drive history to this point where he would intervene in the sending of Jesus Christ. And we see that the whole Old Testament drives towards this one point, and it points to Jesus. So, for example, in Luke chapter 24, when the disciples are on the road to Emmaus after the resurrection of Jesus from the dead, the disciples were leaving Jerusalem in great disappointment because Jesus didn't turn out to be the great messianic political redeemer that they had hoped. They were probably looking for political freedom, but not expecting that this new kingdom would look differently to what it did as in the Old Testament, to be part of the people of God. And they encounter this man on the road to Emmaus. This man begins to explain to the disciples beginning with Moses and all the prophets, of how the scriptures, the Old Testament, they were the scriptures they had at that point, spoke or foretold of Jesus. And it's only later that these disciples actually realized they were talking to Jesus. So when we read the Old Testament, in a sense we need to read it a little bit like in the shoes of these disciples on the road to Emmaus. We need to walk it to see how Christ is revealed in the Old Testament. We need to put on the walking shoes of this expanding Christian community to ask, what is the significance to us as the Christian community? How is Christ revealed in the Old Testament? And in saying this, we see how the life and ministry of Jesus Christ was, in a sense, the hints and shadows that the Old Testament tells us and points us towards in this life and ministry of Christ. That what also this story of the road to Emmaus kind of is comforting, because these disciples didn't necessarily see it themselves. They had to be told how Jesus was foreshadowed in the Old Testament. They had to study and have help from this person that they were walking with. And so reminds us that it's not always obvious, but it's there. And as New Testament readers, we read with the eyes of faith in Jesus Christ. We look back through the cross to the Old Testament to see Jesus revealed. Now, that doesn't mean that we have to see Jesus in every little sentence or word, because sometimes Jesus fulfills a promise directly, like what he does in that promise in Genesis 12 to Abraham, that through Jesus, the seed of Abraham, all the nations of the world will be blessed. But it's important that we don't try and force it. We don't have to see Christ in every verse. And we'll look at how we can do that, how we can see Christ fulfilled in the Old Testament as we go. And we see, in particular, in the book of Matthew, it kind of gives us an example of how we see Christ fulfilling the Old Testament. Because what we see, rather than just sort of every verse pointing to Christ, we see that Christ fulfills the Old Testament in the big picture. We see that, if you think back to this sort of story of the Old Testament, we see that a relationship with Abraham is forged and a promise is given, that from Abraham this family was born. They went down to Egypt to escape famine and death. Then we see that they then come up out of Egypt under the leadership of Moses. They cross through the Red Sea, where they go into the desert, where they're tempted for 40 years, and eventually then they go in to cross the Promised Land. We see in the first, particularly 5 chapters of Matthew, this same story of the Old Testament, of ancient Israel, their story, in a sense, is paralleled by Jesus. Jesus is taken, we hear about his birth, and then he's described how Jesus goes down to Egypt to escape the death, escape the slaughter of Herod. Then once he's in Egypt, we see that eventually he comes up. And at the waters of baptism, like at the Red Sea, we see that Jesus, a special term is used of Jesus. That at his baptism, we hear a voice. And this voice says, "This is my beloved Son." We see this has strong parallels to the Exodus. That as Moses said to Pharaoh, "Let my son go, let my people go," this term of the Son of God was referred to as Israel at the Exodus. That was a special name that was given to them. And that as they crossed the Red Sea, they became, in a sense, the people of God and what was called the Son of God. And in the same way at Jesus' baptism, it's like crossing through the waters. We see Jesus is identified as the Son of God. Jesus then goes into the wilderness like ancient Israel, where instead of being tempted for 40 years, is tempted for 40 days. But where Israel failed to be a people of faith, we see that Jesus succeeds. Jesus succeeds to then leave the desert, go into the promised land, and begins to take the promised land. But he doesn't take it by physical force like what they did in the Old Testament, in the book of Joshua. He begins to take this promised land by preaching the good news, by healings, deliverance, and manifestations of miracles. He begins to encounter in the spiritual realm to take this kingdom of God. And in the same way, we see his life parallels that of ancient Israel. And so it doesn't have to be kind of every little verse points to Jesus, because the Old Testament as a witness, as a testimony in itself, points to the life and ministry of Jesus Christ. And so this story reminds us that as the New Testament readers, they identified Jesus as being part of the story of ancient Israel. That at times, he parallels their very testimony, that where they failed, as any of us would, we see that Jesus succeeded. And Jesus succeeds to continue and to inaugurate a new kingdom that identifies the people of God, that is open to all believers. Anyone can join. The only requirement is faith in him. And so we, as the early church, as participants of this community, began to read back their Old Testament and see how God had revealed himself, and to see how they were to live as the people of God. And as we noted in Peter, to understand their calling, Peter looks to the calling of Israel given at the Exodus to be able to understand what the calling and vocation of the early church is. That we have this glorious calling, this wonderful mission as Christians, little Christ, disciples of Christ, we're called to follow after. And so we read the Old Testament to help us in our mission, to help us in our life together as the Christian community. But the story did not end with the New Testament church either. We see that we're still waiting when God will intervene within all of human history and bring that to a close. And so in the meantime, as the church, we continue this story as participants of the people of God. And so it's important that we ask, how do we contribute as individuals within this ongoing community of God? So we need to ask, what is the significance for me? Our corporate identity as readers of the Old Testament is in continuity with ancient Israel and with the New Testament people of God. So we continue their story. We continue the mission, and we continue the calling that was established by the New Testament church and by ancient Israel by extension. But in the midst of this, each of us have our own individual calling. We have our individual experience, our own journey of struggle, faith, joy, triumph, wherever we're at. And so in the midst of that, each of us look to God for our individual guidance and how we are to outwork this mission and calling that is given in the broader context to the people of God. And so when we're asking what is the significance for me, we're asking, what is God saying uniquely to me through this passage? Me in my time, in my culture, where I am, in my shoes that I'm wearing. What is God saying to me through this passage? Me, who is part of the Christian community that is the continuation of ancient Israel. And so as we read the Old Testament, God speaks to us through the text. So I'm not suggesting that every time we pick up our Old Testament that there's going to be trumpets blasting and sort of this glorious revelation that will occur every time. But what we see is that God will speak to us through the story, through the bigger picture of the story of what God has been doing in history and in the world. Sometimes it'll seem like trumpets are blasting and it's a glorious revelation, and they're great moments. But we see that God calls us and God speaks to us each time we read our biblical text. And so as we read, it's important that our hearts and our minds, our wills and our emotion are open for the Holy Spirit to speak to us directly through our Old Testament and speak through that text into our lives. And while we'll outline that further in Lesson 7, we see it's a bit like we're wearing our own shoes. So having walked with the sandals of ancient Israel and having walked with the shoes of the New Testament community, we now are wearing our shoes. So this is representative of what's going on in my world as a unique person in a unique situation. And this is a crucial element of this reading model, and probably one that we're most comfortable with and most familiar with. And we see that there's all different ways that God speaks to us through these different texts. Sometimes we find encouragement through the narrative and the stories and experiences of others. Sometimes we find guidance in the laws as they provide a foundation for how we behave and our moral behaviour. Sometimes the wisdom writings give us insight into our relationships and our work and our family. And sometimes the Psalms just touch our hearts with the honesty and rawness of their experience. So for each of us, it's important that to get a balanced perspective and a balanced reading, that we hear and in a sense we walk in each of these shoes. And so to miss part of the testimony is to miss part of the fullness and the depth of what God is saying. And just as we finish up, we'll just like us to look at a passage to see how this is outworked in our practice. So we're kicking goals together. So if you'd like to turn with me to Psalm 23. Hopefully a familiar text for many of us. Psalm 23. And as I read this out, I want you to be thinking, what is this passage saying for them, for us, and for me? The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not be in want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. He guides me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. We see that this psalm is very important to each of these three different communities or readers that we've highlighted through our shoe analogy. And in a sense, it's a poem that describes the character and the nature of God through the images that was common to the lifestyle of an ancient Israelite. And we see there's two main images that are significant to them, that spoke to them in their culture, in their time. We see the first image is one of shepherding. So the first 4 verses refer to someone who has been experiencing a pastoral context. Pastoral as in animal husbandry and sheep and living off the land, so to speak. The second analogy is one of feasting, another important image and concept for ancient Israel. And so we see that this passage is an example of poetry, and we'll look in lesson 5 at the different types of writing that ancient Israel produced. But we see that it's a poem that God speaks to them where they're at, speaks to them in concepts and images that were familiar to their ancient culture. And so for the agrarian society, the pastoral society of ancient Israel, sheep were very important. They were an essential part of their economy because sheep can survive on a minimal amount of food and water, and they can be moved quite easily to different grazing points. And they don't have to be fenced in as much. They can be left to themselves and they'll kind of stick together. But the sheep weren't necessarily, the way that the sheep were cared for was very different within this ancient society to how we care for sheep within our modern society. And that's where we stand on this horizon, looking out at a different culture and time of the ancient Israelites as we read the text. Because modern sheep farming in Australia, for example, it's thousands of acres and might be just hundreds of sheep that are scattered around the place and penned in, and the farmer might travel by helicopter and just survey the grounds. And so it's not really there's a lot of sheep, and the shepherd wouldn't really know exactly how many or know much about the sheep. Well, they know a lot about sheep in general, but not individual care of each sheep. Whereas in ancient civilizations, a really rich sheep owner or shepherd would have 100 sheep at the most. Often there'd be only about 10 sheep that they would look after. And there was a much more interaction and relationship with the sheep. And that the sheep were completely helpless without their shepherd, because the shepherd provided everything for them. The shepherd provided the water. The shepherd provided the protection against any animals or predators that we might find. And the shepherd was the constant companion of the sheep. And so when Jesus talks about my sheep know my voice, that's how the shepherd was understood and their role within the ancient Israelite community. The second image presented is of a table spread as a banquet. But this is no ordinary feast we see here in verses 5 onwards. We see that this is a banquet fit for a king. Banquets in the Old Testament were times of celebration and fellowship. And we see that even in the sacrificial system. So the whole worship system of Israel kind of culminated in this sort of meal, that peace offering, and this meal that represented the restoration of fellowship with God in the peace meal. And so there's a sense of peace and a sense of tranquility that's evident as the guest is welcomed and honoured with these amazingly generous gestures. Now, when we combine these images of shepherd and feasting, they highlight to us something of the nature of God. We can see something about God through this testimony of Psalm 23, that the king of the ancient community was meant to represent God to the people. And this poem is traditionally understood to have been written by King David. He was a shepherd before he ascended the throne, and he ruled the people as a shepherd king, reflecting God's ultimate reign over them. And from this lineage, we see Jesus Christ, the ultimate shepherd king, would come. In John 10, we see that Jesus identifies himself as the good shepherd. He is identifying himself as God, and he's identifying himself as the one who exhibits all the traits of God within this psalm, the one who is the protector, the provider. And we see that ultimately in the gift of salvation that Christ offers. Because this shepherd of Jesus Christ goes one step further. He lays down his life for the sheep. He offers himself as an own sacrifice for the benefit of the sheep that he serves. And when Jesus, at his crucifixion, the soldiers nailed above the cross, here is the King of the Jews. Because we see Jesus wasn't just a shepherd. Like David, he was a shepherd king. And once resurrected, we see that Jesus appeared to his disciples, and he encouraged those who would be leaders of this New Testament church to be good shepherds of the flock, to feed the sheep, to look after the sheep, to mimic him. And when we remember the sacrifice of our shepherd king, we remember that as a community as we celebrate communion or Eucharist together. The celebration of the communion meal. And so we see that this passage has significance not just to them of what it tells us about God as being like a shepherd and like a king, but this passage has significance for us because we see in it Jesus Christ, his own work on the cross, his willingness to sacrifice himself to be our true shepherd king. But we don't leave it there. As we ask the significance for us, we continue the mission of Christ. So we're also called to be good shepherds. We're also called to shepherd the flock and to look after them and be willing to also offer our lives in service of God to help one another. And so this psalm testifies to the nature and the character of God. And we also ask, though, what is the significance to me? And for each of us, that will be different. For each of us, there will be something within this passage that will just jump out at us as we read it that is significant on a personal level. And so for me personally, for example, when I ask what is the significance to me, it reminds me that whatever decision that I make, I have a good shepherd who's looking after me. That though I walk through valley of the shadow of death, as Psalm 23 says, I can trust God that he will guide and direct me. I can have confidence that God will be the one who guides and leads me to the places where I'm meant to go. And so it's a psalm that encourages confidence and trust within me. And that's what I get from it personally. But for each of us, it will be different. And so I hope that's helped you just to grasp a little bit of what these significant questions are like. And as we practice together, we'll be more and more confident readers of the Old Testament. So thank you, and I look forward to sharing with you in the next lesson.